The wind carried many secrets through Aspen Grove National Forest, but none quite as extraordinary as the story of Mike Reynolds and the bear they would come to call Aurora. When an injured mother bear with 4 hungry cubs appeared at the doorstep of the Trailhead General Store, it set in motion a chain of events that would test one man's courage, divide a community, and ultimately reveal the true meaning of compassion. This is a story about second chances, both for a wounded animal fighting to protect her young and for a man haunted by his past. What happens when fear meets compassion at the edge of wilderness? The choice Mike Reynolds made that spring morning would change everything in Pine Ridge forever. The Trailhead General Store stood like a weathered sentinel at the boundary where Pine Ridge ended and Aspen Grove National Forest began. Its wooden walls had withstood decades of harsh mountain winters, and its wide porch offered weary hikers a place to rest before continuing their journey into the wilderness. Behind the counter stood Mike Reynolds, a man as weathered as the store itself. At 45, the lines on his face told stories of a life lived outdoors, but his eyes, once bright with purpose, now carried a wariness that came from looking too long at his own regrets. Tourists who stopped for supplies or locals who came for their weekly necessities saw only a quiet shopkeeper who kept to himself. Few remembered that Mike had once been Pine Ridge's most respected wildlife veterinarian, the man everyone called when an injured animal needed help or when wildlife strayed too close to town. His expertise had earned him recognition throughout Colorado, and his dedication to preserving the delicate balance between human and animal worlds had made him something of a local legend. That was before the incident that locals still discussed, in hushed tones when they thought Mike couldn't hear. 3 years ago, a young hiker had been attacked by a mountain lion near Pioneer Falls. Mike had been called to track and subdue the animal. The plan was to relocate it far from hiking trails, but something went terribly wrong. The tranquilizer dose Mike administered had been miscalculated, not enough to fully sedate the predator. When the animal unexpectedly awakened during transport, it attacked one of the rangers on Mike's team. Though the ranger survived, his injuries were severe and Mike's reputation crumbled overnight. An investigation cleared Mike of negligence, citing equipment malfunction as the primary cause, but Mike couldn't forgive himself. The ranger, Jason, had been his friend, a young man with a promising career ahead of him. Now Jason walked with a permanent limp and had transferred to a desk job in Denver. Each time Mike saw Jason's parents in town, their polite but distant nods were painful reminders of his failure. In the aftermath, Mike surrendered his veterinary license, quietly selling his practice and purchasing the old general store when its previous owner retired. The store, with its location at the edge of town, offered exactly what Mike wanted: minimal interaction with people who knew his story and proximity to the wilderness he still loved but no longer felt worthy to protect. Mike's world contracted to the 4 walls of his store and the small cabin behind it. His days followed the same pattern: opening at 6, restocking shelves, helping the occasional customer, and closing at 7. The monotony was broken only by Dave Wilson's visits. The 70-year-old mail carrier had known Mike since he first arrived in Pine Ridge 15 years ago and refused to let him disappear entirely. Dave delivered mail to the store 3 times a week, always lingering longer than necessary, sharing town gossip that Mike pretended not to care about, and leaving newspapers that Mike claimed he didn't read but secretly devoured after closing. "You can't hide forever, Mike," Dave often said. "The mountains have a way of calling us back to who we really are." Mike would always smile politely and change the subject, but Dave's words echoed in his mind during the long, quiet evenings when he sat on his back porch, watching the forest and listening to distant howls and calls, a world he once belonged to but now observed from a distance. Spring arrived early that year in Pine Ridge. The snow melted from the lower trails by mid-April, and hikers began appearing at the store with increasing frequency. Mike noted the changing seasons with detached interest, making sure to stock more water and trail mix as tourist season approached. He was arranging a new display of hiking maps one Tuesday morning when something caught his attention outside: movement at the edge of the tree line behind his store. At first, Mike thought it might be early hikers cutting across his property to reach the trailhead, but the movement was too low to the ground, too cautious. Years of wildlife observation had trained his eye to recognize animal behavior, and something about this movement seemed desperate. Mike stepped onto his back porch, binoculars in hand, and what he saw made his heart stop. A female black bear emerged from the trees, moving with obvious difficulty. Her right front paw barely touched the ground as she limped forward, and her coat hung loose on her frame, indicating significant weight loss. Behind her, 4 tiny cubs, smaller than they should be for spring, tumbled after her. Even from a distance, Mike could see they were undernourished, their movements lacking the playful energy bear cubs typically displayed. Mike's mind raced with professional assessment. The mother's injury had likely limited her ability to hunt or forage properly through the winter. The small size of her cubs suggested she'd given birth in her weakened state. Without intervention, the entire family might not survive the month. For a moment, Mike's old instincts surged. He mentally catalogued treatments, considered whether she had been caught in a trap or suffered a wound from a hunter's bullet. But then reality crashed back. He was no longer Dr. Reynolds, wildlife veterinarian. He was just Mike, the store owner, who minded his own business. "Not my problem," he muttered, turning to go back inside. But something made him look back. The bear had stopped at the edge of the clearing, her dark eyes fixed on Mike's porch. There was no aggression in her posture, only exhaustion and something Mike recognized from his years of animal rescue: a desperate plea. The logical part of Mike's brain listed all the reasons to call animal control immediately: danger to the community, liability issues, the fact that he no longer had the authority or equipment to treat wild animals. But another part of him, the part that had dedicated his life to wildlife before fear and failure intervened, couldn't look away. For 3 days, Mike watched the bear family from a distance. The mother had created a makeshift den in a hollow just within the tree line, visible from Mike's back porch. She ventured out occasionally to forage, but returned quickly to her cubs, her movements becoming increasingly labored. Mike found himself leaving food, first at the edge of the forest, then gradually closer to his porch. At night, he researched her symptoms in his old veterinary textbooks, which he'd never been able to bring himself to sell. On the 4th morning, Dave arrived with the mail to find Mike sitting on his back steps, staring at the tree line. "Something interesting out there?" Dave asked, settling beside him with a grunt. Mike hesitated, then decided to trust his old friend. "Bear," he said quietly. "Female with 4 cubs. She's injured, badly infected wound on her right leg. Cubs are undernourished." Dave whistled low. "You called animal control yet?" "No." Mike didn't elaborate. Dave studied him carefully. "You thinking about helping her yourself?" "I can't." Mike's voice was flat. "Not anymore." "Can't or won't?" Dave stood, adjusting his postal cap. "Seems to me a bear found her way. To the one person in these mountains who might understand what she needs. Might not be coincidence." After Dave left, Mike sat for a long time, conflicted. The professional in him knew that approaching an injured wild animal, especially a mother, bear with cubs, was dangerous. The memory of Jason's injuries flashed in his mind, the consequence of his last mistake with a wild predator. But the part of him that had once sworn to protect wildlife couldn't ignore the bear's deteriorating condition. That evening, Mike made a decision. He would attempt to treat the bear's wound, just enough to give her a fighting chance. He dug out his old medical kit from the shed and prepared a mixture of antibiotics and wound cleaning solution he'd kept for emergencies. If he could just get close enough to assess the injury properly, maybe apply some topical treatment, it might be enough. As dusk fell, Mike left food closer to the porch than before, mixing in sedative herbs that would make the mother drowsy but not unconscious, just calm enough to allow him to approach. He knew the risk he was taking. If anyone from town discovered what he was doing, he could face serious legal consequences. More importantly, if his approach frightened the bear, she might attack to protect her cubs. Around midnight, the mother bear appeared, cubs trailing behind her. She approached the food cautiously, her movements sluggish from pain and hunger. Mike watched from the shadowed porch as she ate, the sedative herbs gradually taking effect. When she finally settled on the ground, cubs cuddling against her, Mike took a deep breath and stepped forward, medical kit in hand. What happened next would later be described by Mike as a moment of mutual understanding. The mother bear raised her head as he approached, her dark eyes meeting his. There was wariness there, but also something else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. An intelligence that recognized another being's intention to help. She didn't move as Mike knelt beside her, speaking in the low, calm voice he had once used with all his animal patience. The wound was worse than Mike had expected, a deep gash, likely caused by a poacher's trap, now severely infected. Working quickly but gently, Mike cleaned the wound, applied antibiotics, and wrapped it loosely with a bandage that would eventually fall off. Throughout the procedure, the mother bear remained still, her eyes never leaving Mike's face, her cubs watching curiously from behind her bulk. When he finished, Mike backed away slowly, scarcely believing what had just happened. The mother bear lumbered to her feet, tested her bandaged paw, and then did something unexpected. She nudged her cubs toward the edge of the forest before turning back to look at Mike one final time. The look held no gratitude. Bears don't think in human terms, but there was recognition, an acknowledgement of his intervention. Mike watched them disappear into the darkness, his heart pounding with adrenaline and something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The next morning, Mike awoke to the sound of vehicles pulling up to his store. Through the window, he saw Sheriff Greg Tanner's patrol car, along with 2 trucks from the State Wildlife Agency. His stomach dropped. Someone had seen him with the bear. Sheriff Tanner was a practical man who took his job of protecting Pine Ridge seriously. He'd been sympathetic to Mike after the mountain lion incident, but his primary concern had always been public safety. "Morning, Mike," the sheriff said as Mike stepped onto the porch. "Got a report about a black bear and cubs near your property. Apparently someone saw the bear looking pretty comfortable around humans. That's concerning." Mike kept his face neutral. "I've seen tracks. Haven't gotten close." The sheriff studied him. "You know the drill, Mike. Bears that get comfortable around humans become dangerous. State boys are here to track and relocate." "And if they can't relocate?" Mike asked, already knowing the answer. Sheriff Tanner's silence was confirmation enough. As the wildlife officers prepared to head into the forest, Mike felt panic rising. The mother bear was too weak to outrun them, and with 4 cubs, she wouldn't abandon her young to save herself. "She has cubs," Mike blurted out. 4 of them, too young to survive on their own. One of the wildlife officers paused. 4 cubs? That's unusual. Most black bears have 2, maybe 3. "She's special," Mike said, then immediately regretted his choice of words. Sheriff Tanner's eyes narrowed. "You seem to know a lot about this particular bear, Mike." Mike realized his mistake too late. The professional detachment he'd cultivated for 3 years cracked, and the truth spilled out. About the injured bear, her struggle to care for her cubs, and his decision to treat her wound. The revelation spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By noon, Mike's store was surrounded by townspeople with divided opinions. Some, like Linda Peterson from the town council, demanded immediate action. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that got someone hurt last time, she told anyone who would listen. Wild animals are wild for a reason. They don't belong near our homes or businesses. Others, particularly those who remembered Dr. Reynolds' good work before the incident, were more supportive. Frank Martinez, one of the local rangers, openly questioned whether relocation was necessary. If the bear hasn't shown aggression, and if Mike's already treated her, maybe we can monitor the situation instead of charging in with tranquilizer. Guns, he suggested. By evening, Pine Ridge was divided into two vocal camps. One group, led by Linda Peterson, advocated for immediate removal of the dangerous predator and questioned Mike's judgment. The other, smaller group, suggested a more measured approach, allowing the mother bear time to recover and move deeper into the forest with her cubs. Jenny Collins, reporter for the Pine Ridge Gazette, arrived to cover the story, further inflaming tensions with provocative questions about public safety versus wildlife conservation. The peaceful mountain town that had once been Mike's refuge now buzzed with conflict, all centered around his decision to help Aurora, the name some locals had already begun using for the mother bear. Sheriff Tanner called an emergency town meeting that night. The small community center overflowed as residents packed in to voice their opinions. Mike sat alone at the back, uncomfortably aware of the stares and whispers directed his way. "The safety of this town has to be our priority," Sheriff Tanner began. "We have protocols for wildlife encounters, especially with predators like bears. Dr. Reynolds," he caught himself, "Mr. Reynolds may have had good intentions, but he's put us in a difficult position." The debate that followed was heated. Linda Peterson pointed out that tourist season was beginning, and the town couldn't risk visitors encountering a bear that had grown accustomed to humans. Others worried about children hiking near the store. The wildlife officers explained that a bear with 4 cubs would be particularly defensive and potentially dangerous. Mike listened silently until he couldn't anymore. Finally, he stood, and the room quieted. "I know better than anyone the risks of mishandling wildlife," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. 3 years ago, I made a mistake that nearly cost someone their life. I've lived with that every day since." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But this is different. Aurora isn't aggressive. She came to human territory out of desperation, not predatory instinct. She's a mother trying to save her cubs. If we give her time to heal, she'll return to the deep forest on her own." The room erupted in arguments. Sheriff Tanner called for order, then addressed Mike directly. "It's not just about this bear, Mike. It's about precedent. If we let her stay, what about the next bear or the next mountain lion? Where do we draw the line between compassion and public safety?" The meeting ended without resolution. Sheriff Tanner agreed to delay any action for 48 hours, giving Mike time to prove that Aurora was recovering and would soon leave the area voluntarily. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the townspeople filed out, Sophia Tanner, the sheriff's 17-year-old daughter, approached Mike. Unlike her father, Sophia had always been fascinated by wildlife and had often visited Mike's veterinary practice before it closed. "I believe you," she said simply. "About Aurora, Dad's just doing his job, but he doesn't really want to hurt her either." Mike nodded, touched by her support but weighed down by the enormity of what he'd done. In trying to save one bear family, he'd stirred up the very public attention he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Worse, he'd staked his credibility, what little remained, on the behavior of a wild animal he couldn't control. That night, Mike couldn't sleep. The responsibility he'd accepted weighed heavily. What if Aurora didn't leave? What if she approached someone else in town, someone who might panic and harm her? What if, despite his treatment, her wound worsened and she became desperate enough to attack? Morning brought no clarity, only a steady drizzle that matched Mike's mood. He opened the store mechanically, though few customers came in the rain. Around noon, Dave arrived with the mail and a concerned expression. "Town's talking," he said, settling into the chair by the counter. "Nothing else on anyone's mind but you and that bear." Mike sighed. "I made a mistake getting involved." Dave shook his head. "That's not what I see. I see a man who finally stopped hiding from who he really is." "And who's that?" Mike asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. "Someone who cares," Dave said simply, "about all living things, not just the ones that vote or pay taxes. That's always been you, Mike, even when you tried to be someone else." After Dave left, Mike found himself staring at the forest through the rain-streaked window. Aurora and her cubs hadn't appeared today. Had they already moved on, or had the commotion from yesterday frightened them deeper into hiding? Mike made a decision. He would find Aurora, assess her condition, and if necessary, help her relocate. Farther from town. It wasn't ideal. Approaching her in the forest rather than on his property increased the risk. But he had less than 24 hours before Sheriff Tanner would take action. The rain intensified as Mike headed into the forest, following the faint trail he'd observed Aurora using. The earthy scent of wet pine needles and moss surrounded him, awakening memories of countless trips into these same woods when he was the area's wildlife expert. For the first time in 3 years, Mike felt like himself again, focused, purposeful, and connected to the wilderness around him. 2 hours into his search, with rain soaking through his jacket, Mike found signs of Aurora's passage, distinctive paw prints in the mud, bark stripped from a tree where she'd foraged. He was close. Rounding a thick stand of aspens, Mike stopped short. There, in a small clearing ahead, was Aurora with her cubs. The sight struck Mike with both relief and concern. Aurora was moving better, putting more weight on her injured paw, but she was dangerously close to Pioneer Trail, one of the most popular hiking routes in the area. If hikers encountered her there, especially with the cubs present, the situation could turn dangerous quickly. As if confirming his fears, Mike heard voices approaching along the trail, hikers undeterred by the rain. Aurora heard them too, her head lifting, nostrils flaring. The cubs, sensing their mother's alertness, clustered closer to her. Mike recognized the moment of decision. Aurora could flee deeper into the forest away from the hikers or move toward the potential threat to protect her young. In that critical moment, Mike did something that defied all wildlife management protocols. He deliberately made his presence known, stepping into the clearing and calling Aurora's name softly. The bear turned toward him, recognition visible in her posture. Mike continued speaking in low, calm tones, gradually moving between Aurora and the approaching hikers. It was a calculated risk. Mike was betting on the connection he'd established with Aurora during her treatment. Not friendship, as humans might understand it, but a tentative trust. His presence might be less threatening than the unknown hikers, giving her a focus point. While he guided her away from the trail, the gamble worked. Aurora gathered her cubs with soft grunts and followed Mike as he slowly backed deeper into the forest, away from the hiking trail. The hikers passed by, oblivious to how close they'd come to a potentially dangerous encounter. For nearly an hour, Mike led Aurora through the forest, gradually steering her toward a remote valley where bear sightings were common, but human traffic was minimal. When they reached the valley, Mike stopped. Aurora seemed to understand they had reached their destination. She examined the area, discovering a stream rich with fish and berry bushes beginning to flower. The cubs immediately began exploring, their energy better than when Mike had first seen them. Mike watched them for a long time, knowing this would likely be the last time he saw Aurora. The rain had stopped, and shafts of late afternoon sunlight broke through the trees, illuminating the bear family in a golden glow. Aurora turned to look at Mike one final time before leading her cubs toward a sheltered area that would make a suitable den. The moment felt like both an ending and a beginning. The return journey to Pine Ridge was long, giving Mike time to reflect. He'd crossed a line today, inserting himself into a situation that wildlife management professionals would have handled differently. But he'd also prevented what could have been a tragic encounter between hikers and a mother bear protecting her cubs. Most importantly, he'd given Aurora and her family a chance at survival in a world that was increasingly hostile to wild creatures. As Mike emerged from the forest near his store, he was surprised to find Sheriff Tanner waiting. The sheriff's expression was unreadable. "Found her?" Mike said simply. "Relocated her to North Valley. She's moving well, cubs are looking stronger. She won't come back to town." Sheriff Tanner studied him for a long moment. "You went after her alone. That was reckless, Mike." "Maybe," Mike conceded, "but necessary. The wildlife officers wanted to track her at dawn tomorrow. I was coming to warn you." Mike nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. The sheriff had been giving him a chance to resolve the situation his own way. "North Valley is good," Sheriff Tanner said finally. "Remote enough to keep her away from tourists. Plenty of natural food sources. I'll let the state boys know we've handled it." He turned to leave, then paused. "The town needs someone who understands wildlife, Mike. Has for 3 years now." The implications of the sheriff's words stayed with Mike long after he'd gone. That night, as Mike sat on his porch watching the stars emerge above the forest, Dave's mail truck rumbled up the drive. It was well past delivery hours. "Thought you might want to see this before it hits everyone's mailbox tomorrow," Dave said, handing Mike a copy of the Pine Ridge Gazette. The front page headline read, "Local store owner relocates bear family, averts potential tragedy." Jenny Collins' article described how Mike's wildlife expertise had prevented a dangerous encounter between hikers and a mother bear with cubs. The tone was respectful, even admiring, quoting several residents who expressed gratitude for Mike's intervention. Most surprising was a statement from Jason's parents, the first time they'd publicly mentioned Mike since the accident. "What happened to our son was a tragic accident, not malice or incompetence. Perhaps it's time Pine Ridge remembered the good Dr. Reynolds did for our wildlife before that day, and the good he might still do." Mike looked up from the paper, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know what to say." Dave smiled. "You don't have to say anything, but maybe you might think about what's next. The mountains have been calling you back for 3 years, Mike. Maybe it's time to answer." In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge's attitude toward Mike gradually shifted. The division that had briefly threatened the town's harmony began to heal. Linda Peterson still maintained that wildlife belonged in the wild, but even she acknowledged that Mike's solution had been effective. Tourist season began without incident, and hikers exploring North Valley occasionally reported distant sightings of a black bear with 4 cubs, all appearing healthy. Mike found himself fielding questions when customers visited his store, not just about trail conditions or equipment, but about local wildlife. What should hikers do if they encountered a bear? How could the town better manage its trash to discourage scavengers? The questions were tentative at first, then increasingly confident, as people remembered that the quiet store owner had once been their trusted wildlife expert. 1 month after Aurora's relocation, Mike received a letter from the state wildlife agency. They were establishing a new position, community wildlife liaison, someone who could bridge the gap between wildlife management officials and local communities. They wanted Mike to consider applying, noting that his handling of the Aurora situation demonstrated exactly the balanced approach they were seeking. Mike read the letter twice, then set it aside to watch the sunset over the forest. He thought about Aurora and her cubs, about second chances and redemption, about fear and courage and finding one's way back to purpose. He thought about the wilderness that had always called to him, even when he tried to ignore its voice. The next morning, Mike Reynolds opened the Trailhead General Store as usual. But beside the register, he placed a new sign: Wildlife Questions Welcomed. It was a small step, but an important one. Mike couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to move forward. One day, one decision, one act of compassion at a time. The story of Mike Reynolds and Aurora became something of a legend in Pine Ridge. Parents told their children about the injured bear who sought help from the one person who could understand her need, and about the man who found his way back to his true calling by helping a mother protect her young. It was a reminder that sometimes the most healing journeys begin with the courage to reach across boundaries, between human and animal, between past and future, between fear and hope. As for Aurora and her cubs, rangers occasionally reported sightings deep in the forest. The cubs grew strong and eventually left to establish their own territories, but locals swore that every spring a large female black bear could be seen at the edges of North Valley, watching from a distance as if remembering the man who had once helped her find her way home. If this story touched your heart, remember that compassion often requires courage, and that sometimes the greatest healing happens when we extend help to others, despite our own wounds. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of redemption and second chances, and click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another journey of transformation that might just change the way you see the world around you. An investigation cleared Mike of negligence, citing equipment malfunction as the primary cause, but Mike couldn't forgive himself. The ranger, Jason, had been his friend, a young man with a promising career ahead of him. Now Jason walked with a permanent limp and had transferred to a desk job in Denver. Each time Mike saw Jason's parents in town, their polite but distant nods were painful reminders of his failure. In the aftermath, Mike surrendered his veterinary license, quietly selling his practice and purchasing the old general store when its previous owner retired. The store, with its location at the edge of town, offered exactly what Mike wanted: minimal interaction with people who knew his story and proximity to the wilderness he still loved but no longer felt worthy to protect. Mike's world contracted to the four walls of his store and the small cabin behind it. His days followed the same pattern: opening at 6, restocking shelves, helping the occasional customer, and closing at 7. The monotony was broken only by Dave Wilson's visits. The 70-year-old mail carrier had known Mike since he first arrived in Pine Ridge 15 years ago and refused to let him disappear entirely. Dave delivered mail to the store 3 times a week, always lingering longer than necessary, sharing town gossip that Mike pretended not to care about, and leaving newspapers that Mike claimed he didn't read but secretly devoured after closing. "You can't hide forever, Mike," Dave often said. "The mountains have a way of calling us back to who we really are." Mike would always smile politely and change the subject, but Dave's words echoed in his mind during the long, quiet evenings when he sat on his back porch, watching the forest and listening to distant howls and calls. A world he once belonged to, but now observed from a distance. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, with heavy snowfall lasting well into April. Mike had grown accustomed to the silence of snow-muffled forests and the rare footprints of winter hikers around. His store he kept to himself even more during these months, the cold providing a natural barrier between him and the outside world. His evenings were spent by the wood stove, reading old veterinary journals he couldn't bring himself to discard, occasionally making notes in the margins, corrections and updates based on research he still followed despite his self-imposed retirement. The first true signs of spring came almost overnight. A warm front moved through the mountains, melting snow rapidly and awakening the dormant forest. Birdsong replaced winter's silence, and streams swelled with runoff. Mike noticed the change, with mixed feelings. Spring meant more hikers, more tourists, more interactions he'd rather avoid, but it also meant the return of the wildlife he still quietly monitored from a distance. The fox family that denned near the creek, the elk herd that grazed in the high meadow, visible from his cabin's attic window. Mike was preparing for the seasonal shift, taking inventory of hiking supplies he'd need to restock, when Dave arrived with the mail and a community bulletin announcing the spring festival. Pine Ridge's annual celebration marked the official start of tourist season, a weekend of activities designed to attract visitors and boost the local economy after the lean winter months. Town council's hoping for record attendance this year, Dave mentioned, settling into his usual chair by the counter. Linda Peterson's been working overtime to get the word out to Denver and Colorado Springs. Says we need the tourism dollars, more than ever. Mike made a non-committal sound, busy arranging energy bars on a display near the register. They're asking all local businesses to participate, Dave continued, watching Mike carefully. Even the ones at the edge of town. Mike paused. I pay my business association dues. That's participation enough. Dave sighed. You know, people have mostly moved on from what happened. Jason's parents even asked about you last week, wanted to know if you were doing okay. Mike's hands stilled. What did you tell them? The truth, that you're surviving, not living. Dave stood adjusting his postal cap. Think about the festival, Mike. Might be good to remind people you're still here. After Dave left, Mike continued his inventory with mechanical precision, trying to push the conversation from his mind. He had no interest in the festival, in pretending to be part of a community that had once turned its back on him. Yet Dave's words about Jason's parents lingered. Had they really asked about him? The thought was both comforting and painful. That evening, Mike closed the store early. The spring thaw had revealed maintenance needs he'd neglected, a sagging step on the back porch, loose shingles on the cabin roof. Physical labor had become his therapy over the past 3 years, the mindless repetition of hammering and sawing, drowning out unwelcome thoughts. He was replacing the rotted porch step when movement at the forest edge caught his eye. Years of wildlife observation had honed his peripheral vision, making him attuned to subtle shifts in his environment. Mike straightened slowly, careful not to make sudden movements as he turned toward the tree line. For a moment he saw nothing but the usual spring foliage, young leaves unfurling on aspen branches, patches of wildflowers emerging in sunny spots. Then he spotted it. A dark shape moving cautiously between trees. A bear, and not just any bear, a female black bear, moving with the distinctive caution of a mother with young. Mike remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow. Black bears weren't uncommon in these mountains, but they typically avoided human habitations, especially females with cubs. Yet something about this bear's behavior struck Mike as unusual. She wasn't simply passing through. She was deliberately approaching the clearing behind his cabin, her movements hesitant but purposeful. As the bear emerged further from the trees, Mike's trained eye immediately spotted the problem. She was limping badly, favoring her right front paw, which she held slightly aloft as she moved. Even from a distance, Mike could see that her coat lacked the healthy sheen of a well-fed bear emerging from hibernation. She was thin, dangerously so for a nursing mother. The realization hit Mike suddenly. Cubs. Where were her cubs? A mother bear this early in spring should have cubs nearby, especially one in this condition who would be reluctant to leave them. As if answering his unspoken question, small movements behind the mother bear revealed not one, not two, but 4 tiny cubs stumbling after her. Mike's breath caught. 4 cubs was exceptionally rare for an American black bear. Twins were typical, triplets uncommon, but quadruplets were almost unheard of. The sight would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but coupled with the mother's obvious injury and poor condition, it was alarming. The cubs were undersized, their movements lacking coordination, suggesting they were struggling with insufficient nutrition. The mother's injury had likely limited her ability to forage effectively, and feeding 4 hungry cubs would tax even a healthy bear's resources. Mike's mind automatically began cataloging symptoms, possible treatments, and survival scenarios, the professional assessment he'd performed countless times during his veterinary career. The mother's limping suggested a puncture wound, possibly from stepping on a sharp object or worse, from a hunter's bullet or trap. The wound was almost certainly infected based on her reluctance to put weight on the paw. Without intervention, the prognosis was poor. The mother's condition would deteriorate, her milk production would decrease, and the cubs, already struggling, would weaken further. Eventually, she would be unable to protect or feed them, leading to the likely death of the entire family. For a brief, intense moment, Mike felt the pull of his old identity, the urgency to help, to heal, to intervene. His hands actually twitched toward the shed, where he still kept his veterinary supplies, never quite able to discard them, despite his self-imposed exile from practice. Then, reality crashed in. He was no longer Dr. Reynolds. He had no business interfering with wildlife. The proper procedure was to call the ranger station, report the bear family, and let the authorities handle it. That was the responsible action, the expected action. Mike reached for his phone, then hesitated, his gaze returning to the struggling bear family. The authorities would have limited options. They might attempt to capture the mother for treatment, but with her weakened condition and 4 cubs to protect, the stress of capture could kill her. More likely, they would determine that a habituated injured bear near a human settlement posed too great a risk. The outcome would be euthanasia for the mother and a wildlife rehabilitation center for the cubs, if space was available. If not, Mike lowered the phone without dialing. Just this once he would observe before reporting. Professional curiosity, he told himself. Nothing more. For the next hour, Mike watched from his porch as the bear family cautiously explored the edge of his property. The mother kept her cubs close, occasionally nosing them back when they strayed too far. Despite her injury, her maternal instincts remained strong. She investigated an old apple tree that had dropped its final withered fruits months ago, turned over rocks searching for insects, and eventually settled beside a fallen log while her cubs nursed. The intimacy of the scene struck Mike deeply. Here was a mother fighting against impossible odds to keep her young alive, pushing through pain and hunger with single-minded determination. Something about her struggle resonated with him, touching. The part of himself he'd tried to bury beneath guilt and self-recrimination. As dusk fell, the bear family retreated into the forest. But Mike knew they hadn't gone far. The mother's condition would prevent extensive travel, and she'd found a relatively safe spot with potential food sources. She would return. That night, Mike pulled his old veterinary manuals from the bookshelf, blowing dust from volumes he hadn't opened in years. He read until his eyes burned, refreshing his knowledge of ursine anatomy, wound treatment protocols, and dietary requirements for lactating bears. It was purely academic, he told himself. Information gathering, not preparation for intervention. Yet, when he finally went to bed well past midnight, his dreams were filled with bears and wounds and the weight of consequential decisions. Morning brought clarity, if not certainty. Mike rose before dawn, moving purposefully around his small kitchen as he prepared what looked like an unusual breakfast. Into a large mixing bowl went oats, honey, crushed vitamin supplements, and finally, several spoonfuls of antibiotic ointment carefully worked into the mixture. It was a concoction he'd developed years ago for treating wild animals that couldn't be directly handled, medication disguised in irresistible food. Mike carried the bowl to the edge of his property and placed it precisely where the mother bear had rested the previous evening. Then he retreated to his porch to wait, binoculars in hand, his old field notebook open on his lap. The sun had barely cleared the eastern mountains when the bear family emerged again from the forest. The mother approached the bowl cautiously, circling it several times before investigating its contents. Her hunger eventually overcame caution, and she consumed the mixture quickly, licking the bowl clean before shepherding her cubs back into the trees. Mike made detailed notes about her movement, her coat condition, and the cubs' behavior. He estimated their ages at about 8 weeks, born during hibernation and now facing their first spring in a weakened state. In normal circumstances, they would remain with their mother for up to 17 months. But these were not normal circumstances. Over the next 3 days, Mike refined his approach. Each morning, he left medicated food for the mother and observed her progress carefully. By the 3rd day, her limp was less pronounced, and the cubs seemed more energetic. Mike had expected improvement, but was still relieved to see tangible evidence that his intervention was helping. What he hadn't expected was how this daily ritual would affect him. For the first time in 3 years, he felt purposeful, engaged, with the world beyond his self-imposed boundaries. The bear family's struggle had become intertwined with his own journey toward redemption, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge this connection consciously. On the 4th morning, Mike's routine was interrupted by an unexpected vehicle pulling into his parking area. Sheriff Greg Tanner's distinctive patrol SUV with the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department logo emblazoned on its side. Mike's stomach tightened as he watched the sheriff emerge and approach the store, his expression unreadable beneath his department-issue sunglasses. Greg Tanner had been sheriff for nearly a decade, a position he'd earned through a combination of fair-mindedness and pragmatic problem-solving. He'd been one of the few people who hadn't openly judged Mike after the mountain lion incident, though his primary concern had always been community safety rather than personal relationships. "Morning, Mike," Sheriff Tanner said, removing his sunglasses as he entered the store. "Got a minute?" Mike nodded, setting aside the inventory clipboard he'd been holding mostly for show. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Had an interesting call from Marge Wilkerson yesterday. Says she was hiking the Ridge Trail and spotted a black bear with cubs unusually close to your property." Sheriff Tanner's tone was conversational, but his eyes were evaluating Mike's reaction. "Thought I should check it out, given the proximity to town and the festival coming up." Mike kept his expression neutral. "I've seen tracks. Haven't gotten close enough for a good look." It wasn't technically a lie. He hadn't approached the bears directly, maintaining a safe distance during his observations, but the omission of his feeding routine and medical intervention hung in the air between them. Sheriff Tanner studied him for a long moment. "You know, most people would have called the ranger station immediately if they spotted a bear with cubs near their property, especially someone with your background. Like you said, I've just seen tracks." Mike busied himself straightening a display of topo maps. "If I see anything concerning, I'll make the call." The sheriff nodded slowly. "See that you do. Festival brings families with kids, lots of folks who don't know how to act around wildlife, bears that get habituated to humans." "I know the risk, Sheriff," Mike interrupted, an edge creeping into his voice. "Probably better than most." "Sheriff." Tanner held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just doing my job, Mike. No offense intended." He moved toward the door, then paused. "By the way, Town Council's expecting all businesses to participate in the festival this year. Direct order from Linda Peterson herself." Mike barely suppressed a grimace. Linda Peterson, head of the Town Council and self-appointed guardian of Pine Ridge's reputation, had been one of his most vocal critics after the mountain lion incident. Her concern had seemed less about Jason's injuries and more about the potential impact on tourism. "I'll pass," Mike said flatly. "Store will be open for hikers, but I'm not setting up a booth or whatever Linda has planned." Sheriff Tanner shrugged. Your call, but might be good for business. More importantly, might be good for you. With that parting comment, he replaced his sunglasses and headed back to his vehicle. Mike watched him drive away, unease settling in his stomach. The sheriff hadn't believed his evasion, that much was clear. More concerning was Marge Wilkerson's sighting. If hikers were spotting the bear family, other reports would follow, increasing pressure on local authorities to handle the situation. Time was running out, both for the bears and for Mike's quiet intervention. He needed to accelerate the mother's healing and help her relocate deeper into the forest, away from human activity. But how could he guide a wild bear family without direct contact? And what would happen when the bears inevitably encountered other hikers who might react with fear rather than understanding? These questions occupied Mike throughout the day as he mechanically assisted the few customers who wandered into his store. By closing time, he had formulated a tentative plan, one that would require crossing boundaries he'd established for himself 3 years ago. As dusk fell, Mike gathered supplies from his shed, items he hadn't touched since surrendering his license: a long-range tranquilizer dart gun loaded with a mild sedative, wound treatment materials, a tracking collar originally purchased for a wolf study that had been abandoned due to funding cuts. Most importantly, he pulled out his old field medicine kit, its contents still organized with the precision that had once defined his professional life. The plan was risky, but calculated. Mike would sedate the mother bear just enough to treat her wound directly and attach the tracking collar. The sedative was mild, enough to make her drowsy but not unconscious, reducing the risk to both her and her cubs. With the collar in place, Mike could monitor her movements and guide her towards safer territory by strategically placing food supplies along a predetermined route leading deeper into the forest. As Mike prepared for this intervention, doubts crept in. What if the sedative was too strong? What if the mother bear reacted aggressively to protect her cubs? What if his intrusion caused her to abandon the relatively safe area she'd found? And underlying these practical concerns was a deeper question. What right did he have to intervene at all after his previous failure? The memory of Jason's face after the mountain lion attack flashed in Mike's mind. The pain, the fear, the unspoken accusation. Mike had promised himself he would never risk another life through his actions. Yet here he was, preparing to sedate a wild predator near a populated area without authorization. Mike's hands stilled on the tranquilizer gun. Was he making a terrible mistake, driven by arrogance or a misguided need for redemption? Or was this genuinely about saving a bear family that would otherwise die without intervention? The question remained unresolved as darkness fell completely, forcing Mike to postpone his plan until morning. He secured his equipment in the shed and returned to his cabin, sleep eluding him as he weighed risk against necessity, professional judgment against personal demons. Dawn arrived with unexpected company. Mike had just stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, when Dave's mail truck rumbled up the drive, hours earlier than his usual delivery time. "You're up early," Mike observed as Dave climbed from the vehicle, a newspaper tucked under his arm rather than his usual mail satchel. "Thought you might want to see this before the rest of town," Dave replied, handing Mike the Pine Ridge Gazette. The headline made Mike's blood run cold. "Dangerous wildlife near festival grounds. Authorities consider preemptive action against bear family." The article, written by Jenny Collins, the Gazette's most sensationalist reporter, detailed multiple sightings of a potentially aggressive black bear with cubs near hiking trails. It quoted Linda Peterson extensively about the unacceptable risk to festival visitors and mentioned that state wildlife officials were considering a removal operation before the weekend. "It gets worse," Dave said, noting Mike's expression. "Linda's called an emergency town council meeting for this evening. From what I hear, she's pushing to have state wildlife officers come in tomorrow." Mike's mind raced. Tomorrow? That's not enough time to... He caught himself, but not before Dave's eyebrows rose. Not enough time for what, Mike? Dave asked quietly. You know something about these bears, don't you? The moments stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Mike sighed and gestured for Dave to follow him to the back porch. There he explained everything: the injured mother, the 4 undernourished cubs, his covert feeding and medication regimen over the past few days. Dave listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. When Mike finished, Dave remained, silent for several moments, gazing out at the forest edge where the bear family had first appeared. You're treating her without a license, he finally said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And you were planning to sedate her and attach a tracking collar? Yes. Dave nodded slowly. That's a lot of lines crossed, Mike. Legal lines. I know. And Mike stared into his cooling coffee. I just couldn't call it in, knowing what would happen. The mother would be euthanized, Dave stated flatly. Almost certainly. 4 cubs is too many for most rehabilitation facilities, especially this time of year when spring rescues fill available space. They'd try, but... Mike didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the likely outcome. Dave studied his friend's face. You really think you can save them? Get them healthy enough to survive deeper in the forest? The mother's improving. Another week of treatment and proper nutrition, and she'd have a fighting chance. Mike's voice strengthened as he spoke, his confidence in his assessment genuine. The cubs are already showing better coordination, more energy. They could make... But they don't have a week. Not with Linda Peterson whipping the town into a panic and the festival coming. Dave rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Unless what? Unless someone bought them time. Someone respected enough to make the town council reconsider their timeline. Mike shook his head. I'm hardly that someone. Linda Peterson would sooner listen to the bears themselves than to me. I wasn't talking about you. Dave stood, decision made. I'm going to that council meeting tonight. So are a few other people who might have different perspectives on wildlife management than Linda Peterson. Dave, you focus on getting that bear family ready to move, Mike. I'll handle the town politics. Dave's tone brooked no argument. Just promise me. One thing? What's that? Be careful. These mountains need you too much to lose you twice. After Dave left, Mike moved with renewed purpose. The newspaper article had transformed his tentative plan into an urgent necessity. He needed to treat the mother bear's wound directly and begin guiding the family deeper into the forest immediately. There was no more time for gradual approaches or second-guessing. Mike prepared a stronger sedative mixture in food, calculating the dose carefully based on the mother's estimated weight. He placed it at the forest edge and retreated to his shed, where he could observe through a small window while gathering his medical supplies. The bear family appeared within the hour, the cubs playing cautiously while their mother investigated the offering. She consumed it quickly, her hunger overriding any suspicion about the strange flavor. Within 20 minutes, her movement slowed, and she settled heavily against a fallen log, her cubs gathering around her in confusion at her unusual lethargy. Mike approached slowly, medical kit in hand, talking in a low, constant monotone to announce his presence. The mother bear's eyes tracked him drowsily, but she made no attempt to rise or call her cubs away. The sedative had worked precisely as intended, reducing her fear and aggression without rendering her unconscious. Kneeling beside her, Mike experienced a surreal moment of connection. Here he was, after 3 years of self-imposed exile, practicing the medicine he'd once loved. His hands moved with muscle memory, cleaning the infected puncture wound on her right paw, applying antibiotic ointment directly and bandaging it with a special wrap designed to fall off naturally after several days. The cubs watched from a slight distance, too young to recognize him as a threat, but old enough to be wary of anything unfamiliar. One particularly bold cub approached, sniffing curiously at Mike's boot. The mother bear made a soft grunting sound, and the cub retreated, but not before fixing Mike with a gaze that seemed impossibly knowing for such a young animal. After treating the wound, Mike carefully fitted the tracking collar, adjusting it to ensure it wouldn't interfere with the mother's movement or the cub's nursing. Throughout the procedure, he maintained a calm, reassuring monologue, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You're doing great," he murmured, as much to himself as to the bear. "Just a little longer, then you can take your family somewhere safe." When he finished, Mike backed away slowly, giving the mother bear space to recover from the sedative. The entire procedure had taken less than 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime, a span in which Mike had reclaimed something essential about himself that had been lost for 3 years. Returning to his cabin, Mike activated the tracking system on his laptop, relieved to see it functioning properly. The collar would allow him to monitor the bear family's movements and strategically place food along a route leading away from town and deeper into the protected wilderness area of Aspen Grove National Forest. Mike's plan was taking shape, but its success depended on factors beyond his control. Most importantly, the town council meeting that evening. If Dave could convince them to delay any action against the bears, Mike might have the time needed to complete their treatment and relocation. If not, state wildlife officers would arrive tomorrow, and all Mike's efforts would be for nothing. As the day progressed, Mike found himself checking his watch frequently, imagining the arguments being made in the community center, wondering whether compassion or fear would prevail in Pine Ridge's approach to the bear family. The uncertainty was agonizing. Just after 9 that evening, headlights swept across Mike's cabin windows as a vehicle pulled into his driveway. Mike opened the door to find not only Dave, but also Frank Martinez, one of the senior rangers at the Aspen Grove station, and to Mike's surprise, Sophia Tanner, the sheriff's teenage daughter. Dave's expression was unreadable as he stepped onto the porch. "You'd better put on some coffee, Mike. We have a lot to discuss." The four gathered around Mike's small kitchen table, steam rising from hastily filled mugs. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Frank finally spoke. "Dave tells me you've been treating an injured mother bear with cubs," he said, his tone professional rather than accusatory. "Says you've got her on a tracking collar and plan to relocate her deeper into the forest." Mike glanced at Dave, who nodded encouragingly. "That's right. Without authorization, without a license." Frank stated these facts without inflection. "Yes. Why come to me now?" It was Dave who answered. "Because the town council voted tonight to bring in state wildlife officers tomorrow morning. Armed officers with orders to remove the bear family by any means necessary." Mike's stomach dropped. "So you failed?" "Not exactly," Sophia interjected, speaking for the first time. "The vote passed, but my dad managed to stipulate that removal only applies to bears found within 2 miles of the festival grounds." Mike looked confused. "How does that help? The bears are currently less than a mile from town." Frank leaned forward. "It helps if they're not there when officers arrive. If they've been safely relocated beyond the 2-mile perimeter by a qualified wildlife professional working with ranger supervision." "Meaning you," Dave clarified, nodding at Frank. Mike looked between them, understanding dawning. "You're offering to help me relocate them tonight?" "Officially." Frank nodded slowly. "Technically, I'm here to investigate reports of unauthorized wildlife treatment. If I happen to determine that the bears are healthy enough for immediate relocation rather than euthanasia, and if I happen to have an experienced wildlife veterinarian assisting me with the process." He shrugged. "That's just good resource management." "But my license is suspended, not revoked," Frank interrupted. and I have emergency authority to deputize assistance when necessary. Linda Peterson doesn't need to know the details. Why would you risk this for me? Mike asked, genuinely puzzled. After what happened with Jason, because of what happened with Jason, Sophia said quietly. My dad never believed you were negligent, Mike. Equipment fails, accidents happen, but the way this town treated you afterward. She shook her head. It wasn't right. More importantly, Frank added, these bears deserve a chance. 4 cubs is remarkable, worth protecting if we can do it safely. Mike looked at the faces around his table, Dave's quiet confidence, Frank's professional determination, Sophia's youthful idealism. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself he was alone, that the town had turned against him entirely. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, offered without conditions or judgment. How would this work? Mike asked finally. Frank spread a topographic map on the table. You've been tracking the mother bear's movements, correct? Show me their current location and the route you've been establishing. Mike brought his laptop to the table, displaying the tracking data. The bear family had remained near his property after the treatment, the mother still groggy from the sedative. They'll start moving again by midnight, Mike explained. Her system will have processed most of the sedative by then. I've been placing food in a trail leading here. He traced a path on the map toward Medicine Creek Valley. It's about 5 miles from town. Good water source, plenty of natural food, minimal human traffic. Frank nodded approval. Good choice. If we position ourselves carefully, we can guide them along that route tonight, using your food trail and our presence to keep them moving in the right direction. What about the cubs? Sophia asked. They're small, right? Can they travel that far in one night? They'll follow their mother, Mike assured her. And we'll move slowly. Let them rest when needed. The important thing is getting them beyond that 2-mile perimeter before dawn. The plan took shape quickly. Frank would radio his position to the ranger station, officially documenting his investigation. Dave would drive his mail truck to strategic points along the route, providing transportation if the team needed to move quickly. Sophia, knowledgeable about local trails from years of hiking with her father, would help navigate in the darkness. And Mike would lead, using his understanding of the bear family's behavior and needs to guide them safely. As they finalized details, Mike felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting that he'd carried for 3 years. He wasn't alone in this effort. More importantly, he wasn't alone in believing that compassion should guide their approach to wildlife, even when fear suggested easier, more final solutions. At 11:30, the unlikely team set out into the darkness, headlamps illuminating the path ahead, shared purpose driving them forward into the uncertain night. The tracking collar showed the bear family was moving again, beginning to follow the scent trail Mike had established earlier. What none of them realized was that someone else was also moving through the forest that night, someone whose presence would complicate their carefully laid plans and force Mike to confront his deepest fears once more. The night air carried a spring chill as Mike led the small group through the forest, their headlamps cutting narrow paths through the darkness. The tracking collar showed the bear family moving steadily along the food trail Mike had established, heading toward Medicine Creek Valley. So far, the plan was working. They're about half a mile ahead, Mike reported, checking the handheld GPS receiver. Moving well, considering the cubs. Frank nodded, adjusting his ranger hat. If they maintain this pace, they'll cross the 2-mile boundary within 3 hours. Then they're officially outside town jurisdiction. The 4 moved carefully through the underbrush, avoiding direct contact with the bears while ensuring they continued in the right direction. Occasionally, Mike would place additional food, protein-rich mixtures that would help the mother regain strength, at strategic points to reinforce the path. Sophia, despite her youth, proved remarkably adept in the forest. Her knowledge of local terrain helped them navigate shortcuts, keeping pace with the bears without disturbing them. Dave remained mostly silent, bringing up the rear with a quiet steadiness that belied his 70 years. They had been traveling for nearly 2 hours when a sound stopped them, the distinctive crack of a branch breaking underfoot, too heavy to be forest wildlife, too careless to be one of their own. Someone else was in the forest. Frank signaled for silence, extinguishing his headlamp. The others followed suit, plunging them into darkness broken only by patches of moonlight filtering through the trees. Mike's heart pounded as he strained to locate the source of the sound. A beam of light swept through the trees ahead, accompanied by voices, at least 2 people moving roughly parallel to their position. Frank crept forward, gesturing for the others to stay put. After a tense minute, he returned, his expression grim. "Hunters," he whispered. 2 men with rifles. "They're tracking the bears." Mike's blood ran cold. "That's illegal. Bear season doesn't open for months." "Poachers don't care about seasons," Frank replied grimly. "And a mother bear with 4 cubs would be quite a trophy." "What do we do?" Sophia asked, her voice barely audible. Frank considered their options. "I'm going to intercept them. They're breaking at least 3 laws that I can cite immediately. Dave, you should come with me. 2 witnesses are better than 1. "What about the bears?" Mike asked. "If those hunters spook them, the cubs might scatter. We could lose them." "That's why you and Sophia need to stay with the bears," Frank decided. "Keep them moving toward the valley. We'll handle the poachers and catch up as soon as we can." Mike nodded, though the prospect of continuing without Frank's official authority made him uneasy. As the ranger and Dave peeled away toward the hunters' lights, Mike and Sophia continued following the tracking signal, moving with increased urgency. "Do you think those men have been tracking the bears for a while?" Sophia asked as they navigated around a fallen tree. "Possibly," Mike said. "Or they could have spotted them recently and decided to take advantage of the opportunity." He checked the GPS again. "The bears have stopped moving. They might be resting, or they might have sensed the hunters," Sophia finished. His thought. They increased their pace, still careful to move quietly. As they approached the bears' location, Mike signaled for Sophia to stay back while he scouted ahead. Crouching low, he moved to a vantage point behind a large boulder. The scene before him confirmed his fears. The mother bear had gathered her cubs in a defensive position beneath an outcropping of rock. Her posture was alert, head raised to scent. The air, clearly sensing danger, though the hunters weren't yet in view. The progress they'd made was in jeopardy. If the mother bear felt threatened, she might backtrack toward familiar territory near Mike's store, directly into the path of the poachers. Mike returned to Sophia, quickly explaining the situation. "We need to guide them away from the hunters, toward the valley. But the mother's spooked. She won't follow the food trail now that she senses danger." "What if we create a distraction?" Sophia suggested. "Draw the hunters away while giving the bears a clearer path?" Mike considered this. It was risky, but they had limited options. "Here's what we'll do. I'll circle around to approach the bears from the valley side. With the right scent markers, I might be able to encourage them to move in that direction. You head about 100 yards that way." He pointed perpendicular to their current path, "and create some noise, enough to interest the hunters, but not enough to sound human." "Like what?" "Brush rustling, maybe a stick against a tree. Poachers will investigate any sound that might be an animal. Just be ready to move quickly away once they start heading toward you." Sophia nodded, determination in her eyes. "I can do that." "Be careful," Mike cautioned. "If anything feels wrong, you head straight back toward where Frank and Dave went. Don't wait for me." With the plan set, they separated. Mike circled wide, approaching the bear family from the opposite direction. He moved downwind, carrying a pouch of strong-smelling food and scent markers that would hopefully draw the mother bear's attention. From his new position, Mike could see the mother bear more clearly. She remained alert but hadn't moved, her cubs huddled against her. Mike carefully opened the pouch, allowing the scent to carry on the night breeze toward the bears. The mother's head turned, nostrils flaring as she caught the smell of the rich food mixture. In the distance, Mike heard it begin, the subtle sounds of Sophia's distraction. Branches cracking, undergrowth rustling, sounds that mimicked a large animal moving through the forest. The mother bear's attention split, her head swiveling between the food scent and the potential threat. Mike held his breath, willing the mother to choose his direction. Everything depended on her next decision: safety for her cubs, success for their relocation plan, perhaps even lives if the confrontation with the poachers went poorly. For a moment that seemed eternal, the mother bear remained frozen in indecision. Then, with a soft grunt to her cubs, she began moving toward Mike and the valley beyond, away from the sounds of Sophia's distraction. The cubs followed obediently, their small forms barely visible in the moonlight. Relief flooded through Mike as he backed away slowly, maintaining the scent trail leading deeper into the forest. The bear family followed, cautious but determined, instinct driving them toward food and away from perceived danger. Meanwhile, Sophia's distraction appeared to be working. Through the trees, Mike caught glimpses of flashlight beams changing direction, heading away from both their position and the bears. She had successfully drawn the poachers off course. For nearly an hour, Mike continued the careful process of guiding the bear family, placing small amounts of food at intervals while staying far enough ahead to avoid alarming them. The mother's pace was steady, her injured paw clearly benefiting from the treatment Mike had provided. The cubs kept up admirably, though the smallest occasionally needed nudging from its mother. They had just crossed a small stream, one of the boundaries marking the 2-mile perimeter from town, when Mike heard shouting in the distance. The angry voices carried clearly through the night air, followed by what sounded like an argument. Frank had apparently confronted the poachers. The mother bear froze, alerted by the human sounds. Mike held perfectly still, knowing any movement might send her fleeing in the wrong direction. For several tense minutes, both Mike and the bear family remained motionless, listening to the distant confrontation. Then a sound split the night that made Mike's blood run cold, a single gunshot echoing through the forest. The effect was immediate. The mother bear gathered her cubs with urgent grunts, quickly herding them toward a dense thicket. Mike's heart raced as he watched the tracking signal begin moving rapidly, not toward town as he'd feared, but deeper into the forest, away from the gunshot. The mother's instinct to protect her young was driving her exactly where they had hoped she would go. But what about the others? Had Frank or Dave been hurt? What about Sophia? Mike faced an impossible choice: continue following the bears to ensure they reached safety, or return to help his friends. The bears were now moving steadily toward Medicine Creek Valley without his guidance. The tracking collar would allow him to locate them later. His friends might be in immediate danger. The decision made itself. Mike turned and ran toward the source of the gunshot, all caution abandoned in his urgency. He crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping his face as he sprinted back the way he had come. The only thought in his mind was reaching the others before it was too late. As he approached the area where he'd heard the shot, Mike slowed, caution returning. Voices reached him, angry but not panicked. He moved carefully now, staying low and using trees for cover until he could assess the situation. The scene that greeted him was both a relief and a new concern. Frank stood with his Ranger shotgun raised but not aimed, facing two men with hunting rifles. One rifle lay on the ground, apparently kicked away. Dave stood slightly behind Frank, looking shaken, but unharmed. Of Sophia, there was no sign. "Federal offense," Frank was saying, his voice stern. "Poaching in a national forest, hunting out of season, discharging a firearm within 2 miles of a settled area. You're looking at serious jail time." It was a warning. "Shot!" one of the men protested. though his belligerent tone suggested little remorse. "We have a right to protect ourselves from dangerous animals. The only dangerous animals I've encountered tonight are standing right in front of me," Frank replied evenly. "Now put down the other rifle, nice and slow, or we'll add assaulting a federal officer to your charges." The standoff continued, tension crackling in the air. The second hunter still held his rifle, not quite pointing it at Frank, but not surrendering it either. Mike remained hidden, assessing how he could help without escalating the situation further. The decision was made for him when a small sound, a twig snapping, drew everyone's attention to the right. There stood Sophia, partially concealed behind a tree, her eyes wide with fear, but her posture determined. The distraction was all Frank needed. In one swift movement, he closed the distance to the second hunter, disarming him before the man could react. Both rifles now lay on the forest floor, and the hunter's anger gave way to resignation as Frank began reciting their rights. Mike emerged from his hiding place, relief washing over him as he confirmed that everyone was unharmed. Dave gave him a weary smile, while Sophia's face brightened upon seeing him. "The bears?" Frank asked, securing the hunter's wrist with zip ties from his belt. "Crossed the 2-mile marker," Mike reported, heading straight for Medicine Creek Valley at a good pace. The gunshot actually helped, scared them in exactly the right direction. Frank nodded, satisfaction evident despite the tense situation. "Dave, I need you to take your truck to the ranger station. Tell them I've apprehended 2 armed poachers and need assistance. Sophia, you go with him." "What about you?" Dave asked. "I'll escort these gentlemen to the logging road junction. It's the closest point a vehicle can reach." "Mike," Frank turned. "To him, you should continue tracking the bears. Make sure they settle in the valley. We'll handle things from here." The group separated, Dave and Sophia heading back toward town, while Frank marched the subdued poachers in the opposite direction. Mike stood for a moment, watching them go, struck by how quickly alliances formed and plans adapted when necessity demanded. Then he turned and continued into the forest, following the signal from the tracking collar. The bears were moving well, already 3 miles from town and continuing toward the valley. With the immediate threat of the poachers neutralized, Mike could focus fully on ensuring the bear family found a suitable new home. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow by the time Mike reached Medicine Creek Valley. The tracking signal had become stationary about an hour earlier, suggesting the bear family had finally stopped to rest. Mike approached, cautiously, wanting visual confirmation of their condition before returning to town. The valley opened before him, a lush bowl of meadow and forest cradled between mountain ridges. A clear creek meandered through its center, offering both water and the fish that would become an important food source for the bears. Spring vegetation was emerging in abundance, berry bushes, tubers, and the variety of plants that would sustain a recovering mother bear and her growing cubs. Mike spotted them near the creek's edge. The mother had found a small cave in the rocky hillside, providing natural shelter. The cubs were already exploring their new surroundings under her watchful eye, their movements more energetic than Mike had yet observed. The mother herself was moving with greater ease, her injured paw touching the ground more frequently as the treatment began to take effect. The sight filled Mike with quiet satisfaction. They had done it, relocated the bear family to safety before the state wildlife officers arrived. Here, 5 miles from Pine Ridge, Aurora and her cubs could recover and thrive, undisturbed by humans and the complications they brought. Mike settled on a boulder at a safe distance, allowing himself a moment to simply watch the bears in their new environment. The mother's natural instincts had led her to an ideal location, defensible, with abundant food and water, yet isolated enough to avoid human contact. Her resilience impressed him anew. Despite injury and the burden of 4 unusually small cubs, she had never stopped fighting for their survival. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, painting the valley in gold, Mike reluctantly turned to begin. The long hike back to town. The tracking collar would allow him to monitor the bear family's progress remotely, ensuring they remained in the valley away from human settlements. His active role in their journey was complete. The return trip gave Mike time to consider what awaited him in Pine Ridge. There would be consequences for his actions. He had practiced veterinary medicine without a license, interfered with wildlife that many considered dangerous, and potentially complicated a legal hunting investigation by involving a minor. Yet for the first time in 3 years, these potential problems didn't fill him with dread. Something had shifted during the night's adventure, some fundamental realignment of his priorities and fears. By mid-morning, Mike emerged from the forest, behind his store, exhausted but clear-headed. To his surprise, Dave's mail truck was parked in the lot, along with Sheriff Tanner's patrol vehicle. Inside the store, he found not only Dave and the sheriff, but also Linda Peterson from the town council, looking distinctly displeased. "There he is," Linda said as Mike entered, her tone making the simple statement sound like an accusation. "I hope you're satisfied, Reynolds. Your little stunt last night has thrown the entire festival security plan into chaos." Sheriff Tanner held up a hand, silencing her. "Linda, we agreed to let me handle this." He turned to Mike. "Frank radioed, in the full report, said to tell you the mother and cubs are settling well." Mike nodded, too tired to be surprised that the sheriff already knew everything. "They found a good spot in Medicine Creek Valley. Natural shelter, plenty of food. They'll be fine there." "And 5 miles from town," the sheriff added pointedly, "well outside the area of concern for the festival." Linda sniffed disapprovingly. "That's hardly the point, Greg. Reynolds here practiced veterinary medicine without a license, harbored dangerous wildlife near a populated area, and involved your daughter in a potentially hazardous situation." "My daughter," Sheriff Tanner said with unexpected firmness, "made her own decision to help prevent a needless killing. I'm not particularly happy about the risk she took, but I'm damn proud of her reasons." He fixed Linda with a steady gaze. As for the other accusations, Frank deputized Mike under emergency wildlife management protocols, all completely legal. Linda opened her mouth to object, then closed it again, recognizing defeat. "The council will still want a full report," she muttered. "And they'll get one," Sheriff Tanner assured her, "after the festival. Speaking of which, don't you have a ribbon-cutting ceremony to prepare?" The dismissal was clear. Linda departed with as much dignity as she could muster, promising further discussion once the weekend's events concluded. As the door closed behind her, the sheriff turned back to Mike. "Frank stretched those emergency protocols pretty thin," he said conversationally, "but his paperwork is impeccable. Far as the record shows, you acted as a temporary consultant under ranger supervision to relocate problem wildlife. No mention of treatment, feeding, or tracking collars." Mike looked between the sheriff and Dave, understanding slowly dawning. "You planned this before the town meeting?" Dave shrugged. "Not exactly planned. Let's call it preparing for likely outcomes." "Why?" The question that had been building all night finally emerged. "Why go to these lengths for me? For the bears?" Sheriff Tanner considered his answer carefully. "Pine Ridge hasn't been right since you withdrew, Mike. What happened with Jason was tragic, but the way this town, the way we, handled it afterward was worse. We lost something when you closed your practice and disappeared into yourself. I made a mistake that nearly killed someone," Mike said quietly. "Yes," the sheriff acknowledged. "And you've been punishing yourself far more severely than any court would have. Meanwhile, we've had 3 years of wildlife issues handled by state officials who don't know our town or our forests the way you do." He gestured toward the window, toward the mountains beyond. "Those bears aren't the first animals that would have benefited from your expertise. They're just the first that found you anyway." The simplicity of this truth struck Mike deeply. The Bear family had indeed found him, had literally approached his door, seeking help that no one else nearby could provide. Despite his self-imposed exile, his purpose had found him again. Dave handed Mike an envelope. "This came yesterday. I was waiting for the right time to give it to you." Inside was a letter from the State Veterinary Board, responding to an application for license reinstatement that Mike had never submitted. The letter indicated that the board would consider restoring his wildlife veterinary credentials following a 3-month probationary period under qualified supervision. Supervision that Ranger Frank Martinez had apparently already volunteered to provide. "I don't understand," Mike said, looking up from the letter in confusion. "Frank's been working on this for months," Dave explained. "Gathering statements from witnesses to the mountain lion incident, documenting equipment failure evidence, building a case that your license suspension was excessive given the circumstances." "But I surrendered my license voluntarily," Mike pointed out. "No one forced me." "Sometimes the harshest judgments are the ones we pass on ourselves," Sheriff Tanner said quietly. "The question is whether you're ready to reconsider that judgment." The question lingered in the air between them, a doorway to a future Mike had believed forever closed to him. Before he could formulate an answer, the store's door chimed, admitting an unexpected visitor, Jason's mother, Margaret. An uncomfortable silence fell as she approached the counter. Mike hadn't spoken directly with either of Jason's parents since the incident, their interactions limited to distant nods and averted gazes when they occasionally crossed paths in town. "Mrs. Harris," Mike managed, his throat suddenly dry. I heard what you did last night," she interrupted, her voice steady. "With the Bear family." Mike nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "Jason called us this morning," she continued. "Said he'd heard about it from friends in town. He asked us to give you a message." Mike braced himself, expecting recrimination or, at best, cautious forgiveness. What came instead left him momentarily speechless. "He said to tell you that he's applying for a field position again. Limited duties, but it's a start." Margaret's eyes held Mike's. "He said your story reminded him that fear of past mistakes shouldn't determine future choices." With that, she placed a small carved wooden bear on the counter, the kind of souvenir sold in local gift shops, and left without waiting for a response. Mike stared at the small carving, its significance overwhelming. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Perhaps that was still evolving for all of them, but it was acknowledgement, recognition of parallel journeys toward healing. "Well," Dave said into the silence that followed, "I'd say that's worth considering, over a good breakfast. You've been up all night, and my truck has a thermos of coffee with your name on it." He headed for the door, clearly expecting Mike to follow. Sheriff Tanner nodded agreement. "Go on. I'll watch the store for a bit. Something tells me the first day of the festival won't bring you much business anyway." Mike hesitated, then reached over his jacket. As he did, his gaze fell on the tracking receiver still in his pocket, its small screen showing 4 dots clustered together in Medicine Creek Valley, Aurora and her cubs, safely established in their new home. The sight reinforced everything that had happened in the past 24 hours, every choice that had led to this moment of possibility. Outside, spring sunshine bathed Pine Ridge in warm light. The distant sound of the festival preparation drifted from town, music testing, voices calling, community in motion. For the first time in 3 years, Mike felt a tentative connection to that community, a thread reconnecting him to the life he'd abandoned. "You coming?" Dave called from his truck. Mike took one last look at the forest edge where Aurora had first appeared, then turned toward his friend and the waiting vehicle. "Yeah," he said, the word carrying more certainty than he'd felt in years. "I'm coming." 2 months later, Mike stood at the edge of Medicine Creek Valley, binoculars raised. as he surveyed the area where Aurora and her cubs had made their home. Beside him, Frank Martinez made notes on a clipboard, documenting the bear family's progress for official wildlife management records. "Cubs have doubled in size," Frank observed, watching as the 4 young bears tumbled playfully near the stream. "Mother's weight looks good too. That wound has completely healed." Mike nodded agreement. "She's teaching them to fish. Watch how she demonstrates, then lets them try." He couldn't keep the satisfaction from his voice. They'll be ready for their first winter without her after next spring. The tracking collar had been removed 2 weeks earlier once they were certain the bears were firmly established in their new territory. Today's visit was part of the regular monitoring program Mike had established. Monthly observations from a safe distance, ensuring the family continued to thrive while maintaining their natural wariness of humans. "Time to head back," Frank said, checking his watch. "You've got that presentation at the community center at 4. Mike lowered his binoculars reluctantly. These observation visits had become the highlight of his month, milestones marking Aurora's successful integration into her natural environment. But Frank was right. Today's presentation couldn't be delayed. They hiked back toward the ranger, stationed in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Mike, this past 2 months had been a period of unprecedented change and healing. With Frank's supervision, he'd begun the process of reinstating his veterinary license, taking on limited wildlife consultation cases to rebuild his professional confidence. More surprisingly, he'd found himself gradually reintegrating into Pine Ridge's community life. It had started with small steps, attending a town council meeting to present his wildlife management recommendations, helping organize a forest safety workshop for festival visitors, accepting dinner invitations from Dave and his wife. Today's presentation represented a larger step. He was scheduled to speak about black bear conservation to a community audience, including students from the local school. The event had been Sophia Tanner's idea, part of her senior project on environmental education. As they reached the ranger station parking lot, Mike spotted Dave's mail truck waiting. The elderly mailman had appointed himself unofficial coordinator of Mike's reinstatement process, collecting signatures for support petitions and arranging meetings with influential community members. "Perfect timing," Dave called, getting out of his vehicle. "Linda Peterson just dropped this off at the store, asked me to make sure you got it before your presentation." He handed Mike an official-looking envelope bearing the town council seal. Mike opened it with some trepidation. Despite the generally positive shift in community attitude, Linda had remained somewhat skeptical of his return to wildlife work. Inside was a formal letter announcing the council's unanimous approval of Mike's proposal to establish a wildlife education center on his property, along with funding for initial renovations and equipment. The proposal, submitted just 2 weeks earlier, had outlined a vision for a facility that would offer safety training for hikers, wildlife information for tourists, and rehabilitation services for injured animals. A comprehensive approach to fostering coexistence between Pine Ridge residents and their wild neighbors. Mike read the letter twice, scarcely believing its contents. "Unanimous?" he questioned, looking up at Dave. "Even Linda?" Dave grinned. "Turns out, saving a mother bear and 4 cubs makes for excellent tourist publicity. Bear watching tours to Medicine Creek Valley are already booked solid for next spring." He chuckled at Mike's expression. "Don't worry, Frank's team will ensure they're conducted responsibly, with minimal disruption to the bears." Mike shook his head, still processing the approval. The Wildlife Center had been a dream barely articulated, a tentative step toward reclaiming his purpose while acknowledging how that purpose had evolved. That the town council, including his once staunchest critic, had embraced it so completely felt like the closing of a circle begun that spring morning when Aurora first appeared at his door. At the community center that afternoon, Mike faced a packed audience. Familiar faces filled the seats, Dave and his wife in the front row, Sheriff Tanner and Sophia near the back, Jason's parents seated quietly to one side. Even Linda Peterson had made an appearance, though she maintained a somewhat reserved expression. As Mike began speaking about black bear behavior and conservation, he felt the last of his self-imposed isolation dissolving. He wasn't just sharing information. He was reconnecting with his community, rebuilding trust that had been damaged by past tragedy and subsequent withdrawal. After the presentation, during the informal reception, Jason's father approached. The two men had not spoken directly since before the accident. "Margaret and I have been talking," he said without preamble, "about the wildlife center you're planning." Mike nodded, uncertain what would follow. "We'd like to establish a scholarship fund in Jason's name," he continued, "for students interested in wildlife conservation. Maybe some summer internships at your center." The offer caught Mike completely by surprise. That would be wonderful," he managed. "Jason's finding his way back to the work he loves," Mr. Harris said. "Slowly, with limitations, but he's finding his way. Seems right to help others do the same." As the reception continued around them, Mike found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. An injured bear with 4 cubs had approached his store out of desperation, setting in motion a journey of healing that extended far beyond the bear family themselves. Aurora's plight had cracked open Mike's carefully constructed isolation, forcing him to confront both his fears and his essential nature as a healer. Later that evening, Mike stood on his back porch, gazing toward the forest where he had first spotted Aurora and her cubs. The space would soon be transformed into the Wildlife Education Center, but for now it remained as it had been, the threshold between human settlement and wilderness, between past regrets and future possibilities. From inside the cabin came the sounds of planning discussion. Dave, Frank, and Sophia had gathered to help develop programs for the new center. Their voices carried through the open window, filled with enthusiasm and ideas. Mike smiled, listening to their animated conversation while taking a moment of solitude to appreciate how much had changed. The forest beyond his property was darkening with evening shadows, the boundary between town and wilderness less distinct in the fading light. Somewhere in that forest, 5 miles distant, Aurora and her cubs were preparing for night in their Medicine Creek Valley home. Mike imagined them settling into their cave, the cubs curling against their mother's warmth, safe and thriving in their natural environment. Aurora had come to him because she needed help that only he could provide. In saving her, Mike had inadvertently saved himself as well, rediscovering his purpose and his place in both the human and natural communities that defined Pine Ridge. The bear's journey from injury to healing had mirrored his own. Both had found their way home by trusting connections that transcended fear and isolation. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Mike turned back toward his cabin, toward the voices of friends and the future taking shape in their conversations. The doorway between wilderness and community no longer represented a boundary to maintain, but rather a connection to honor. Aurora had shown him that healing required both courage and compassion. Courage to move beyond past failures, compassion for oneself as well as others. Mike paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the forest before stepping inside to join the planning session. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges between human needs and wildlife preservation. For now, though, it was enough to recognize how far both he and Aurora had come. 2 wounded souls who had found healing through an unexpected encounter at the edge of wilderness. Inside the warm cabin, surrounded by people who had become partners in his journey, Mike finally understood what Dave had told him months ago. The mountains had indeed called him back to who he really was, not through dramatic revelation, but through the simple act of helping one injured bear with 4 cubs who had approached his door in desperate need. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.